Hello, Bob.
Hello.
Hello. How you doing?
Dandy, how are you? See, why are
I'm
you over there? I'm
I'm doing
moving
great.
you. Moving you over here. There you are. Okay, good. All right, super cool. And then I can see you. You can see me.
I can see you. I can hear you loud and clear.
If I want to share, I hit the share. Sharing not turned on. Send request. Okay. Let's
Yes. There you go. Try now.
see, share. Now, not as good at Zoom as I am at Teams now. All these things I learned. Let's see here. Let's go PowerPoint slideshow. And how do I say go? Share. There it is. Okay.
All
All
right.
right.
I see your screen.
You can see it? And then if I move from, let's see, if I move the cursor over there, can you
Yep.
see it change colors? Okay, cool.
Wait, change colors. What do you mean?
Well, change
Change
slides.
slides. Yep. Yes, I
All right,
do.
good. All right, so we got all
Gonna.
that working. And if I stop share, it goes back to my camera. Is that right? Stop
Yeah.
sharing.
Yep.
Cool. Because I got stuff to show on camera.
All right.
Um, and good. That means we're working just fine. That's smoother than it's been in years past.
That was nice and breezy. You're a
Absolutely.
seasoned pro. What else do you need?
Probably a second water. Let me go grab that.
Sure. All right.
Hey. And I told my family they had to stop the EDM dance party tonight, so
Oh, such a bummer.
they were very disappointed.
Yeah.
There
Well, they can pick it back up at 8
you
or
go.
7:30 when do you know how long your module's gonna run?
No, in fact, I was
Okay.
going to maybe even run a timer, but I can just look at a clock.
Okay.
We're scheduled for 7:30, right?
So actually they're scheduled until 8 to give you an extra half hour, but you don't need to take the whole time.
Okay.
If they all went until 8, then the course would be longer than we advertised. So if you
Okay.
only take until 7:30, that's totally fine. Yep.
Perfect. And how's the faces looking? Okay. If I get
Yeah.
back there, if I get here, I'm shadowy. Okay, good. No, I have a single lamp T8 fixture over my head that when I made the standing desk, I get too close to it. So I put a piece of paper over it and cut holes in the paper.
Oh,
That's my diffuser
interesting.
to
Very
make light
inventive.
stuff.
Yeah.
I stood here for a while. I'm like, it's just I can't deal with that. So I put the paper up and that was too much. And so I started one night I was sitting here and I took a knife out and I started cutting triangular holes in it.
Yeah. Well, whatever works. Whatever you did, it,
Exactly.
it looks good. It's a good setup.
It goes back to the whole concept of installed base, right?
Yes, that's
It's an
right.
old it's an old Zoom toggle fixture. It's got very nice baffles, but now you can't see them because there's paper over it. But whatever.
Got it. Well, I think Allie just joined us.
Yes, I
Allie's going to
did.
be, hey, Allie. Allie's going to be board volunteer, just here for the evening for the session. So anything that you need, she'll take attendance and things like that. Um,
Fantastic.
but if you need anything, you can let her know and we'll get you covered.
Sounds wunderbar.
And then I think you're also doing next Tuesday's session. Is that right?
Yeah, I am a
Okay.
Tuesday guy. Yep.
All right. Perfect. 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 Well, I'll probably just hang on until the people start trickling in.
Sounds
You got
good.
your backup water. Anything else you need?
Ready to go.
Okay. Have you met Allie before?
Hi, Allie.
Hi. I don't know if
Allie
we
Oh,
have met
works,
before.
yeah, Allie works with me at AE Design actually. And
oh,
she is
okay.
the current vice president on the IES board.
Oh, congratulations. That's where I started.
Thank you.
And then I was in it for years, trust me. So look forward to a long time of service.
Yeah, I have been, trying to figure out how long I'm going to be in it, and I will be much
It's a
older than I am
it's a
now.
it's a
Right.
life it's a life service.
I don't know about life, but it's a few years. And then, I did it all before kids, right? So I did VP for a couple of years, and I did president for a few years, and we changed things around, and we had no
Yeah.
funding. I mean, we had nothing. You guys are so lucky these days to have like a national organization that cares and maybe gives you some money and shit. It's really cool. We made our biggest money off of doing the lamp and ballast show, and we charged those guys money, and that was all the money we made for the whole year. And then we had, volunteers come in to do, events, and we did really cheap places to have meetings with bad food. And yeah,
You made
We
it
still
work.
do that.
we did, but it's better now, I think. I swear to God.
Yeah. Well, you laid the groundstone, and then we built off of that.
Well, it was good that National got involved. And do you guys still send
Yeah,
people to IES conferences and stuff? Do you have enough money to do that?
we do. Yeah, we have a scholarship and a grant, and the grant is used to
Fantastic.
send a student every year. And then some of
Fantastic.
the board members go as well. Yeah, it's
That's
good.
wonderful.
All right. Well, the people are starting to trickle in. I will go ahead and begin admitting them.
Sounds good.
Allie, you have the attendance form.
Yeah, I do. Yep.
Cool. Anything else you need, Allie?
No, I should be good.
Cool. I've never seen this new setup at your new place.
Oh yeah, I have a lot of sun coming in behind me currently.
You
Looks
look
very
like you're downtown somewhere.
I'm not. I am up in Westminster.
Oh, in Westminster. Okay.
Yep. Yep. Not pictured as my cat that's sitting like right here.
Oh, fantastic. Mine might come
Just a
visit
little.
us at some point tonight too. So
Oh, that's exciting.
her name is Cheyenne. She's 16 years old now.
Oh wow.
Yeah, she's a Siamese. We lost her partner a
Cute.
couple years ago, but it was sad. Any
Oh.
case, yeah. How old's
Well,
your how old's yours?
I have two. They are two.
There are two. Oh, fantastic.
Yes. Yes. I got them as kittens and they are a handful.
Wonderful.
Yeah. They're
Wonderful.
lovely.
Yeah, we adopted two at the same time. Ours came from a thing that's now defunct called the Colorado Siamese Rescue.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was fun. And they made you adopt two at once, right? Because they knew that the cats needed interaction, like when you're not going to be around and stuff.
That's
So
pretty much how the place that I adopted a mine from. It was
nice.
$100 for one, 125 for two. So might as well get two.
Oh yeah, and they keep each other occupied at times.
Yes,
Sometimes
yes.
fighting, sometimes hanging out, whatever.
Yeah, mine don't hang out at
No,
all.
not yet.
No.
When they get older, they'll hang out a little.
Yeah. I don't know. We
I'll
got
give
two
you a
because they were
prediction.
a bonded pair, and now you would not be able to tell that they are
Th-
related
They
at
don't
all.
like each other. Okay.
No.
Allie, I do see it's recording already, so you should be all set there. Just keep an eye on it, make sure it keeps recording.
Okay.
And they'll know all about our cats.
That's right. It's
As
important
they
stuff.
should.
What are their names?
Heath and Henry.
Heath and Henry. Two
Yep.
boys. Okay.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Really Heath Bar and O Henry. Candy bars.
Nice. Ours were named after mountain ranges.
Oh, cute.
Cheyenne and Sierra.
Cute.
I like that.
That is really nice.
It was creative on the part of folks at the Siamese Rescue, and we just kept them. We didn't rename them.
I also kept the names that they had.
Nice.
Brian, if you hop off, it should transfer ownership to me, right?
Yeah, it already says that you're the co-host. So I'll just do a quick introduction here at the beginning.
Okay.
Also, you'll just have to keep an eye on the participants tab in case anyone joins a little bit late. You have to actually physically click admit to let them in.
Yep.
So just keep an eye on that.
Okay.
Cool. We'll give it another minute or so. And I think I made a couple notes in the attendance sheet if one or two people said that they couldn't make it tonight.
Okay.
Cool. All right, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. I think we're still waiting on several more.
I think we're waiting on 5 more.
5 more? Okay.
Yeah.
Another minute then. All right, I'm going to do a quick introduction. A couple more might trickle in. Ali, you can just, again, keep an eye on that. Welcome everyone to FOL session 3. New instructor tonight. For those who don't know, which are probably most of you, except for I think there was one person with TLA,
Um,
Bob Hawkins is our instructor for the evening. He's also going to be back next Tuesday teaching another module. Bob's been teaching with us the past 2 years. Is that right, Bob?
3 now. This is the third year, yeah.
This is the third year. Okay. So I am excited to introduce him. He's gonna be doing a virtual session, obviously, but there's also going to be kind of some, moving around, looking at sources and things like that throughout the evening. Um, Allie is the vice president of the IES Rocky Mountain section. She is also on tonight. She'll be the board volunteer, just kind of sitting in with you all. So definitely reach out to Allie or Bob with any questions throughout the evening. I think we're still waiting on a couple people, but thanks for those who tuned in on time. Again, this one's recorded, so we'll send out the recording either later tonight or tomorrow, so you can catch up on that if you have to, or if you're not able to make this one, or if you miss any part of it. I think Chris made this announcement the other day. I understand, some people might be driving or eating dinner or whatever. If you are able to have your cameras on, it's just helpful for the instructors, just to make sure that you're all engaged and getting the most out of this. So keep that in mind. I don't think I have any other announcements. does anyone have any questions from last week, from the first couple of sessions? See a couple heads nodding. I think we're good then. Well, then without further ado, I will hand it off to you, Bob.
Thank you so much, sir.
Of course.
Alrighty, so I'm going to now shift from looking at my face onto the presentation. So I'm going to share and bring the PowerPoint slide and share. And hopefully you are all now seeing that. Is that good?
Yes.
That's good.
Fantastic. All right, so electric light sources. I'm in a unique position to talk about these because I've seen them all. Lots of people up and coming in the design industry right now. If you're working on anything new, lots of these sources are going to be just kind of words that, you know, fuzz your brain for a while. But the thing is in your professional life, you'll probably encounter situations where you're coming into an existing facility as opposed to just designing something new. So if you're coming into the existing facility, it's good to understand the kind of sources that might be present. And that includes things being outdoor, indoor, and all the legacy stuff that's out there. So two words that are really important before even beginning this stuff, so you understand why we're even delving into it. And those two words are called installed base. Right? If you look around the world and you walk into a building or a house or a school or a institution of some kind, and you look around, I guarantee you they're not the same thing as a building that's been designed or built in the last 5 years. So if you have an opportunity to work on those things, it's good to understand what's going on there. And that's what I'm going to try to go through tonight. You might not need the in-depth knowledge as if you were going to be specifying these products, right? But you might need to understand what they are and where they came from and how they were used so that you can move on into, you know, whatever might be current, right? So that's my beginning of everything. All right, here we go. Maybe move the mouse over there, it might help. Click and go. All right, here we go. Continuing education, AIA. You guys will be able to get credits for these things. It's wonderful. Green Building Council, they want you to know about this stuff so that you can help in their mission of reducing the amount of energy that we consume so we don't burn a lot of fuels and all the other kinds of things, right? And Module 2, electric light sources. You bounced around, right? I think you did intro, then daylighting. Now you're back to here, but that, you know, has to do with schedules and such. But it's okay because daylighting didn't involve a lot of these concepts. So today, again, be able to figure out what it is that you're dealing with and how to move on, right? That's what all of these words mean. And here we go. So you may have, I believe, I went through the first module, and I think you've seen this before, right? This timeline of light sources. So people, right? We evolved and came about the use of light at night through fire. Right. And this is why people have a kind of intrinsic attachment to warmth at night, right? And warm colors at night, because that's how we made light, right? And up until the electric light source happened, and even then it wasn't quite as warm as fire, but it was still pretty warm because we had glowy light sources. We heat a wire until it glows light enough, right, to give us light and heat. Up until about 1946 or in the 1940s and World War II is when people figured out how to do fluorescent, right? And that was a major change in everything that happened from that point forward. We won't go into two more things because we'll approach them all as we go through our presentation here. But yeah, the 1940s, there was a World's Fair in the late 30s where they demonstrated the first concept of that. Changed everything, right? So people have evolved for millions of years up until 1940 under things that were basically fire, right? And in 1940, we moved on to new stuff. So we're still in the process of evaluating all that stuff, and we're still influenced by everything that came beforehand, right? We started to figure out old light sources, new light sources, how many watts we were consuming and what those watts were doing to the environment, et cetera. And so we started to do some things like legislation to restrict older and less efficient sources and kind of force us to move on. Along with that, about, see, what was it, back in November, December, I wandered through a Lowe's and they had a table And on that table were a bunch of fluorescent light sources on sale. And why? Because as of the end of the year, apparently, and I don't know if it's Denver or Colorado, I meant to look it up, but you can't sell fluorescent lamp replacements anymore. Not in this state or this town, right? And that moves on with all of these other light source regulations that started to restrict the manufacture of them, right? Now we're even moving on to local restrictions that restrict the sale of them. Now, you can probably still order them online if you have to get a replacement, but I was in the office of a accountant, and they had some really horrible old T8 lens troffers with 18 colors of lamps in them. And I started to talk to her about how the fact that she's not going to get replacement lamps anymore. And she really has to think about upgrading her lighting. Right? Thinking of lighting all the time. That's what I do. All right. Sources. It used to be that you had the source, and then you would put that source into different luminaires. And the source was independent of the luminaires, and you knew a lot about the source. You knew a lot about its shape. You knew a lot about its performance over time, what kind of light it put out, what kind of socket you had to put it in the luminaire, and then you did things with that source in reflectors and refractors to make an entire something, right? There are still, again, when you think about installed base, there's still a ton of those kinds of things out there, right? So you may need to understand what replacement lamps are like in case you need to go into a situation to replace old sources without putting in new fixtures. Right? Again, why we're exploring these things. So electric light sources, things that you may have touched on already in those first things, the amount of light that you get for the amount of watts you input, the shape of that light, right? The color of that light, where does it sit on that black body radiator scale? We'll talk about that probably more when I do next Tuesday. But then for today, right, what is it shaped like? Can you get a replacement lamp to screw into the old spot? Does that replacement lamp make sense? I see this all the time. In fact, one of our engineers' offices I went to not too long ago, you look in the parking lot and they have old school HID fixtures. Somebody has sold them on new technology, and they've screwed in these corncob lamps that go in there, and they completely ruin the way that fixture put out light. Now there might be a dump near the fixture and everything else is dark, but by God, they're saving energy because the lamp fit into the socket and it lit up. But is it the right thing, right? So these are things you have to think about. Life, power, efficacy, all of that is really combined in what we're talking about today. Efficiency, efficacy. When we used to screw in different sources into a reflector system, we would know how much light the source had. We'd have a photometric report that would tell you how much light is coming out of the fixture after you screwed that source into it, and thusly you could compare the two and you could figure out how efficient the fixture was, right? A lot of times now you don't have that separation between source and fixture. It's all integral, right? So the quote efficiency of a fixture is almost non-existent anymore. We tend to look now over on the right-hand side of this slide that says efficacy. And that means how many watts do we put in versus how many lumens do we put out, and skip all the middle stuff. LEDs have actually made our life a lot easier when it comes to looking at light sources and fixtures and how much light they put out and all this stuff, because we don't have to monkey around with all the in-between stuff. How much light did that lamp put out before it got put in the fixture? Who cares? We don't do that anymore. We test in situ. We put the LEDs inside the fixtures. We test them, and you get a report that shows you how much light it puts out, and there's no ambiguity involved at all. So efficiency is almost not even a term anymore, but efficacy is very important. How many watts in versus how many lumens out. And again, we'll talk more about definitions of lumens and all that sort of stuff next Tuesday. Here's a nice chart that shows you why some of those legislations took place, if I can say that, right? Look at the very top left of this particular slide, and you'll see where incandescent lighting was, right? In terms of how many lumens per watt do you get? And if you need X number of lumens to do a certain job, how many watts do you need to consume? And what's that doing, back across the line and burning coal and all the rest of it, right? So you can see incandescent, you see how halogen increased as a range. You see what compact fluorescence did for you, and we'll talk more about that too. I'm not going to go too deep now. Linear fluorescent, right? That particular bar right there that you're looking at, is the reason why we have 2x4 light fixtures. You might wonder, well, why are there those things out there? Why are our ceiling tiles that way? Well, it's because the most efficient source of light that we had to utilize and the one that we could affect the best was 4-foot long lamps. Once you did things with them, made them shorter, bent them into U shapes, did other stuff, they weren't as efficient as they were anymore. And again, this drive to try to get every little bit of efficiency out of our lighting systems was really important. And so you tried to get to the most efficient thing that you could, and that's where 4-foot light fixtures, ruled the universe. Okay. And then you got into things like high pressure sodium metal halide, very HID, high intensity discharge sources, super high amounts of light in a very small package, easy to control, good for sports lighting. Anytime you went to a Bronco game over the last 50 years, you were underneath metal halide lighting until 8 or 10 years ago. I think they relit the stadium, right? HPS, one of the reasons for that particular source, high pressure sodium. These are arc sources that you run electricity through an arc and high pressure generates light. The HPS are very golden and orange in color. And yes, we're drawn to that because of what we've all evolved under. But yes, those lamps had better maintenance characteristics than did the white ones. And when you're a guy at a city and you're having to maintain 800, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 light sources, if you have one that has a longer life source than the other, which one are you going to want? Right? Which one are you going to push? Doesn't matter that the color rendering underneath that source was a quarter of what it was underneath the white one. If it had a double the lamp life and you had to visit half as many fixtures, spot on, let's go. And that's why high pressure sodium became the source of choice for things like roadway lighting and doing things like city streets. LEDs come around and you can see the range that LED covered from the beginning to the end ends up being a lot better than any of the traditional sources that we had. And that's why the LED revolution has taken over. We've gotten better at making them. We've gotten better at making them more cheaply. And so it isn't such a premium anymore, to the point where there are no new product developments going on with any of these other sources, I'll guarantee you right now. None of the manufacturers that we work with, we have 175 now at my place. None of them are doing product development in any source other than LED. So as designers and people who are influencing new developments and projects, you're not going to be looking at this other stuff. But again, you might be involved in the installed base, which is monstrous. How many millions and millions and millions and millions of square feet are operating underneath some of these light sources? My own bedroom operates underneath some of these light sources, right? I have a table lamp. It's got 2 sockets in it. In one side, I have an old, I think it's 60, 80, I think it's a 100-watt incandescent lamp, believe it or not. I still have them. On the other side, I've got an LED replacement lamp. And run them up full and it's great, right? They mix, life is good. But when you really want to get down to low light levels, the replacement LED lamp drops out way before the incandescent does. And you'll see that in some of the slides ahead, where incandescent dimming is still the thing that we're used to having and that we want to be able to get to, and that you really have to pay attention to if you're specifying LEDs or fixtures that just have a socket in them. And you're going to screw in an LED lamp, and it's nowhere near going to get down as low as the old incandescent used to be. So if it's in your bedroom, do you really want that? Maybe then you need to specify a fixture that's got integral LEDs and drivers such that you can get down below 1% or something like that, because that's what we're used to. Okay. All right. So here we go. Incandescent. We already started talking about this. Incandescent technology, if you think about it very simply, is you run a current through a resistive something until that stuff glows. And the more current you run through it, the brighter it glows. And the more current you run through it, the higher the color temperature at which it glows. So if you run up to full, it's at X temperature. If you start to dim it, it gets warmer and warmer and warmer and puts out less and less and less light. And this is what many, 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 many people in the universe are used to, other than folks who were born, in the last 5 years, or last 15 years, or maybe 20, I don't know. We're used to being able to screw in a light, have a very simple dimmer, and run it up and down. So replacement lamps for this are everywhere and it's wonderful, but they don't necessarily react exactly the same, but they save a ton of energy compared to heating up a glowy wire. By the time you heat up the glowy wire, you're putting out, I think if it's at full normal operation, I think you're at about 25, 28, 23, somewhere in there percent light. And the rest of the energy is heat. Right? So not a very efficient way to light places, but by gumbo, it was better than burning gas. Imagine piping gas into your house and the fire hazard that was. Yes, new AC technology and stuff like that also electrocuted people and started fires, but it certainly wasn't as dangerous as piping gas into your house and having an exposed flame in every room where you were trying to make light. Okay, so incandescent technology was amazing, and the transformation that it had. And it's much like now what LED is amazing in the transformation that it has, because we're doing things like reducing temperatures in fixtures, right? We don't have wires glowing at a couple thousand degrees anymore. You don't burn your hand on the LED lamp when you reach in to touch it typically. I used to have like leather gloves and things to go around and relamp things because lamps were so hot. Okay. And with the glowy wire technology and the filaments, the tungsten would leave the filament, and over time, eventually the filament would break. And if any of you are old enough to know, or if you've had the lamps in your house, once you pull them out and they break, you can shake them and you can hear the broken filament rattling back and forth. And so you know that lamp is bad, you got to go get another one. Well, now you get another one, it's an LED replacement lamp, and you don't have that filament thing anymore. Okay. We've talked about this. Lowest cost, high CRI, instant on, very good dimming. It says ease of dimming. Let's just talk about how deep the dimming can go and what people got used to, right? And then you saw on that slide on the upper left side of efficacies, it was just the worst source of anything that we're using nowadays in terms of efficiency or efficacy. Okay. Short life was another issue. Those filaments only lasted so long. And if you have a facility with lots of them in it, it seems like they're going out all the time because you're going up and down that life curve, right? Oh, a note to say right now. The life of all of these fixtures that we're talking about today, other than the LED, right, is based on throwing 100 of them in a room. And when 50 are burned out, that's life. Okay. So if you have these incandescent fixtures at 1,000-hour life, 1,000 hours in, you start to look at how many hours a year you burn things, maybe in an institution as opposed to your bedroom, right? You have to start replacing them pretty quick, right? So there's issues that way. CRI is 100 by definition. This is the source that we were used to, and that's how we developed our color rendering system. So CRI is color rendering index. And we say that a fully volted, operating at its rated voltage, incandescent light source has a CRI of 100. Now, it's still weighted though, right? The spectral distribution of an incandescent light source with that glowy technology with so much heat coming out of it, right? You take a look at that bell curve that we've got over here under wavelength, and you can see how much of that energy is coming out in heat. So when I was a kid, my parents knew a breeder of dogs up in the mountains, and they built dog houses outside, and they put a socket in them, and they heated the dog houses by putting a 100-watt incandescent lamp in there. It was a 70-watt heater, and when things got down to 20 below, if they had a nice little warm dog house for their doggies up there, it was a beautiful thing, right? So you couldn't do that nowadays by screwing in an LED lamp. The dogs would be well lit, but they wouldn't be well heated, right? So it gives you an idea of how those sources work. All kinds of different ways that the sources used to be employed, right? The A19 lamp here being the most common and the one that all of our LED replacement lamps imitate, right? Because of that shape. And then things where they tried to take the amount of energy coming out of that filament and shape it. And so they put reflectors around it to make it into a beam pattern, right? And you had the amount of light that came out of the filament went into the reflectors and then bounced out in the beam. But then you also had the amount of bare light that was from that filament just spilling out the front of the lamps. So you had a lot of extra light besides the beam in a lot of these things, right? So that brings us to things like relighting of stadiums. And goes beyond the incandescent. I'm jumping ahead to HID, but bear with me, right? You used to take that same kind of concept of a lamp inside a reflector to shape a beam, right? Well, the HID lamps of 400 watt, 1000 watt, 1500 watt, all those kinds of things, the beam got down to the field, but then the bare lamp part of it would light the crowd. And it just happened, right? The crowd was lit while you lit the field. Now you come into things like LEDs where you have a much tighter beam and you don't have that spare light going on. They can light the field perfectly and meet the NCAA or the NFL or whatever requirements that they're trying to meet, and the crowd's dark. Some people, when they do these replacements, get that and they actually add extra lights to light the crowd. Some don't. Take a gander next time when you're watching nighttime football events or something, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Differences, right, between those things. And then again, I jump ahead to LED and HID, even though we're back here, because it all sort of makes sense that way to me. All right, here we go. Bases, here we go. I'm going to show you these guys on camera real quick then. Stop share. So hopefully I am large in your screens, am I? All right, good. And then other things I can do so we can make this work better, so you guys can see stuff. All righty. I'm going to hold this up there. All right. So this is a medium base lamp, right? This is one of the original LEDs. Again, I'm jumping ahead, but medium base, very common incandescent socket, A lamps all over the place, right? Now, what they don't show you in that slide there, though, is that you can have medium base as an incandescent light source as well. For a super high wattage fixture we used to have hanging in our foyer, this is actually an incandescent bulb that's got a gigantic base to it. Now, this medium base is more often used for HID stuff, metal halide, HBS, all that kind of thing. But you can have all kinds of different bases, and that's where it gets really tricky if you're coming into a situation where you're trying to get a replacement lamp and do it in LED or something like that. Medium base stuff, pretty easy to come by, but a lot of the other ones that you saw on that screen, maybe. Where are we at here? How do I get back to sharing? Oh, there it is. Share. All right, you should see that collection of bases again. Do you guys see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Super cool. All right, so all the other ways that you could do incandescent lighting, right, and different bases have to fit in there, and they don't make replacement lamps for a lot of that stuff. So you basically have to go to a new fixture, right? Unless you're in, just a very specific couple of these areas where they are now making things that can go back into the socket that you had. So back over here. Tungsten halogen, right? Now this is the second thing down in that initial slide where we saw that incandescent looked so horrible in terms of efficiency. It got a little bit better when you went to halogen. Well, halogen's the same stuff, right? You're taking electricity, you're running it through tungsten, right? And you're making the wire glow. Now the difference, though, is you have shorter, thicker filaments, and you encapsulate the area around them. And instead of just a vacuum inside that lamp, or you replace it with a neutral gas or a halogen gas, and that's why they call these things halogen lamps, right? It's not the halogen that's burning; it's still tungsten, just like an incandescent source. But now we have a very much tinier area around it. I have an example. Can't quite show you with these guys, so I'm not going to do it. But you encapsulate that area there with quartz that can take the heat. And now what happens is any of that tungsten that works its way off of the filament actually combines with that halogen gas, floats around, comes back to the filament and redeposits itself and is now back on the filament. Now, it doesn't go back to the spot where it came from. It'll go somewhere else. But over time, the thing is instead of just evaporating and depositing on the wall of the lamp, so old incandescent lamps that have been in your bathroom for a long time, on the top of them, they're dark on the inside. Why? That's the tungsten that's evaporated from the filament and deposited itself on the wall. In halogen stuff, they never make it to the wall. They're kept in that little tiny capsule, and they come back to the filament and recombine. So the life goes from, say, 750 hours up to like 2,000 hours before they break, or before 50 of them break out of 100 of them break. So major advancement in life. Their color temperature dropped or increased a little bit from like 2,700 to 3,000 K typically. Their life increased, and their depreciation characteristics got better because of that. Right. So halogens made a lot of sense. Now they're way more expensive to make because you have to make this little halogen capsule. You have to evacuate, to put the gas in there. You have to do all these cool things. But it worked out really well in terms of lots of sources that now last a lot longer. Right. Now you get 2,000 hours out of the batch, half of them, right, instead of 750 hours. Low voltage versus line voltage, right? Low voltage is safer. So when you do things like run wires underground out to little fixtures to light up your bushes, it's sort of handy to have that be safer instead of having your kids grubbing around there with a shovel and digging into a 120-volt source and electrocuting themselves, right? So low voltage is a quite a reasonable thing to run fixtures at just from a safety standpoint. But then you can also make a case that the low voltage can be even a little more efficient, and you can do different things with your filaments. Line voltage filaments have to be longer. Low voltage filaments can be shorter. When you go to low voltage filaments, you can then control them a little better, and that can lead to better reflection out of lamps. And so that's where the MR16 was born, right? Low voltage filaments. They crammed it into this thing. They put a lot of watts into it. They figured out these really complicated ways to do dichroic reflectors and things to pull the heat away. And then they could light, say, slides from your slide projector without melting the film. So, and that's what this one's all about, right? The technology that went into an MR16 lamp is bloody amazing. I mean, the layers of coatings to allow certain wavelengths of light to bounce and then other wavelengths of heat to not was really impressive. And you could tell the difference between ones that were done well and ones that weren't. There were some that kept with that basic technology where they let the light or the heat leak out the back, but then there's some where they started to do different, where they, instead of it being for film, right, this is a lighting implement now, and they didn't like the way that that heat and that backlight lit up the back of that can that you had the MR16 into. So they started doing hardcore reflectors that didn't let the heat out the back and shoved it out the front. Well, if you were lighting chocolate art, that wouldn't be so bad, or wouldn't be so good at that point, right? So it depends on your usage and which level of coating and what you went to. And we have lamp books, and it was very complicated, quite frankly. And the technology was amazing, right? But again, now we don't have to worry about specifying and figuring out those differences. We just might have to work out what we have to replace it with if that's what we're after, right? Incandescent lamps, again, life was the big deal. When you only have a 750-hour lamp, how do you make it last longer? If you undervolt it, look at the blue line going through the roof, even if you just undervolt it by 10%. So that's where, if you've ever seen it in practice, right, there used to be things called 130-volt lamps, but you operated them at 120, and all of a sudden you were getting these long lives out of them. So it really helped for the maintenance kind of issues, right? We're not going to too deep into it, but I just wanted you to know about that stuff. All right. Glowy wire technology, you heat it, it glows, it gives light. It gives a lot of heat while it gives that light. And they say 1,000-hour life, it's really kind of around 750. Halogen helps, extends both efficiency and lamp life, right? And it changes the color a little bit to be a little more crisp. Low voltage can be safer. It can give you better control. But then again, the heat, right? This is another thing that is a little different now. You used to have to design things to hold stuff that got to 1,000 degrees. right? Your socket had to deal with that. It had to be ceramic. That's why I have ceramic sockets, because the heat involved is just ridiculous. Okay. When 2/3 of your source energy is heat and a third is your light, no matter how much you're tweaking around between halogen and incandescent, right? Heat is a major issue. So lots of lighting manufacturers had labs, and a lot of that lab was devoted to heat testing to make sure that the components would put up with this stuff. And that goes for both incandescent and I'm reaching ahead into HID as well. Any questions so far? All right, good. All right, fluorescent sources. I touched on that earlier. 1940 something, or the 38 World's Fair, they first demonstrated it in 1940s. World War II, went everywhere. Offices in the 50s and 60s, you'll see pictures of, people hanging out underneath these 4-foot long fixtures, maybe with baffles, maybe without, doing their jobs, doing their factories, and doing it all for way more efficient than incandescent used to be, and with way less maintenance than incandescent used to have, even though the color was horrid compared to incandescent. So anything that still required color as a part of the job was probably still lit with halogen or with incandescent, because the early fluorescents were just terrible when it comes to color. In the 60s, for color rendering index, you had things like cool white and warm white phosphors, and they were just terrible. People put them in their kitchens, they couldn't tell what they were cooking, right? It was so bad, and I remember this from my youth, right? That you never know nowadays, but back then, women were the only people who used a lot of makeup. And when they went to work, they wanted to look good under the work light. And they were in tune with the fact that work light sucked compared to home light. And so they would have these makeup mirrors that would have different light sources in them. And so they'd pop these makeup mirrors on in the morning, turn it on to cool white, make their face up so it looked good under cool white, and head off to work. Right? Women were a lot more in tune with color temperature and color rendering than any guy was, unless you were a geek like me, hanging out in lighting, because they saw the difference in the things that they were doing with things like makeup, right? But fluorescent got better over time, and we'll talk about that too, right? So fluorescent, entirely different system here. There's still a glowy wire in a fluorescent lamp. It's at the end, it's called the cathode. And that's the thing that typically failed in a fluorescent lamp. But what that cathode did is it provide ions to then go into the mercury arc that you struck. The mercury arc gave off a little bit of visible light, but a lot of UV. And then we figured out with phosphors how to take that UV, absorb it, and re-radiate it back into the visible spectrum. Right. And we did that okay from the 40s on. When we got into the 80s, we got a lot better at it because we discovered some better phosphors, and we could do multiple coatings of these things. So that instead of the god awful 60 plus CRI light, we could actually get decent color rendering out of these things. We get in the 70s, we get in the 80s. If you spend a lot of time and money and a lot of phosphors, you get in the 90s of CRI out of a fluorescent source. Okay. I wish I had one of those lamps. One of our lamp guys used to have one that was uncoated for half of it and coated on half, so you could see the purple mercury arc and then see the rest of the lamp glowing. It'd be super cool, but I don't have one. All right. Now, in order to maintain that arc, though, you had to have electronic components that would not allow it to pull itself to death and explode, right? It had to control the amount of electricity going from one end of that arc to the other. That arc needed to be a fair amount of length in order to work. These low pressure mercury arcs that are basically what fluorescent lamps are. They're low pressure mercury lamps with phosphors in them to take the low pressure mercury arc and re-radiate it into the visible spectrum, right? So you needed a ballast. They had to be long, right? Hence our 4-foot thing that we talked about for the good ones, right? By the time they got better at it, you could get good CRI out of them, and you could get better and better efficacies out of them as we went through time as well. So I'm going to go real quick back to sharing. I'm going to stop that. And we're back to me, hopefully. And I wanted to give you all an idea of what we're talking about. So this is a T12 diameter piece of acrylic. That's what was used from 1940 through, right? When we started to use better phosphors, we decided we didn't need as much space inside, so we went to T8. And what these numbers refer to are eighths of an inch in diameter on the tubes, right? So when we went from T12 to T8, we also started using better phosphors. And we also started using different pin configurations so that you couldn't cross over between the two. So by the time you got to T8, you were getting better and better color, better and better efficiencies. And then in the fight for every percent we could get, because we're trying to reduce the energy that goes into a building, right? When you can get a 5%, a 3%, an 8% gain, you did it. And if you did that by lamp technology, if you did it by ballast technology, the incremental gains would eventually add up to something that actually, made it worthwhile to do new technology, right? And that's where T5s came in, right? So T12, T8, T5, eighths of an inch in diameter. By the time you got to this little skinny bastard, we had even better phosphors. We ran it at different, the energy in the arc was run differently, and we got even better efficiency, not efficacy, right? Efficiency, lumens per watt out of the source, not the fixture, um, out of these skinny guys. And then they also did two different versions of these skinny guys. They did one that was super efficient at a lower wattage. They did one that was less efficient, but by God, you could pack 54 watts into one of these for an output. And by the time you did 54 watts of output in a 4-footer of these, and you only used one in cross section instead of two or three in cross section to get the light you wanted, then your optical efficiencies of those fixtures got a lot better. The lamps didn't get in each other's way. You could use a single lamp that used to take two, and now you could design reflectors and fixtures smaller, and you could get better control out of them by the time we advance to this stuff. And you'll find this in many, many, many places still, right? T8s and T5s. T12 should be gone at any facility that you encounter now by now. Good God, I hope so. Right. But you will encounter both of these. And then we started monkeying around with the electronics that drive them. Right. So you could take T8s and you could have ballasts, the things that kept the arc from, going explosive, right? You could control it. You had ballasts that would have the ability to make the lamp go anywhere from, say, 78% of its rated output up to 120% of its rated output. And that gave you yet more control over your job and the amount of energy that you used on that job, right? Because you could do things like use a 2-lamp fixture at a higher ballast factor than a 3-lamp fixture at a regular. Well, you're buying a third less lamps for the entire facility, one, right? Two lamps don't get in each other's way as much as 3 lamps do, right? So again, you get a little more efficient. So all of these things we monkeyed around with for percents of gain in efficiencies in lighting systems so that we could save energy while still providing good light for folks, right? Fluorescent technology ruled for many, 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 many years, right? Until the LED revolution started to take over. All right. And hence the reason for 2x4 ceiling tiles. Why did they pick that size? Because 4-foot lamps are the deal, right? That's where all the energy and efficiency went into on both those T5s, the T8s. That's where the rubber hit the road where we get some more efficiencies. All right, back over here. Here's a lot of the differences. Now,
Hey,
one
Bob,
thing that came, yes,
can I ask a question on that last slide?
please.
I'm sorry if I missed this, but you say bad popular image. What do you,
Right. The initial fluorescent lamps from the 1940s and 50s and 60s were horrible for color. So people hated going to work, and they were also driven by
okay.
they were also driven by magnetic ballasts, right? And the magnetic ballast operated the lamp at 60 hertz. Some of us, me included, I can see that stuff out of the side of my eye. I see flicker. I'm very sensitive to it. And so there were people who didn't want to go to work because it was bad color and the flicker bothered them, right? The things that got fixed when we went into like T8 technologies, we went to better phosphors and we went to electronic ballasts that would run those fixtures at like 20,000 hertz instead of 60. And so now you didn't have that flicker issue anymore.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Oh, no problem. Well, think back to the example of my mom having to do her makeup underneath horrid color, right? Ugh. That was what, stuck in many people's minds for a long time when it came to fluorescent lighting. And then remember I talked about the arc having to be fairly long. There's some pretty enterprising folks who started to figure out that they could take a tube and wrap it and wrap it and wrap it and get a long enough arc, but yet make a small lamp. And that's what compact fluorescents are, right? You have to have enough length for that arc to work. You can't just make a 2-inch tube. It won't, the low pressure mercury arc doesn't work that way. So you had to have a couple feet of arc. And so how do you do that if you want to make it into a small lamp? That's where compact fluorescence came in. Compact fluorescence could now start to go into places that incandescent lamps used to screw into. And if you redid the optics a little bit and stuff, you could make them work pretty well for a third the energy of what an incandescent used to do, and 10 times the life of what an incandescent used to have. Even though the linear lamps are 20 or 30 times the life, getting 10 times out of a compact was still way better. Especially if you think about a facility that's got a lot of these things in it, right? And you're constantly out replacing lamps. Well, if you can get away with a compact fluorescent now instead of an incandescent, a lot of your maintenance stuff went away. And this is what laid the groundwork then for LEDs later. Is those compact fluorescents had a much shorter life than the long tube ones. And if you turned them on and off much, they were horrid. They would fail really quick. So the first place that LEDs started to really gain traction was in things like restrooms with motion sensors that turn on and off a lot. That would just destroy fluorescent lamps. But LEDs didn't care, right? So again, I'm mixing sources as we go along, but it sort of makes sense. Right, there we go. Now, this is important for future technology as well, right? Is we figured out with that low pressure mercury arc how to take the light from it, or the energy emitted by it, if it wasn't in the human light spectrum, right? And how to absorb it and re-radiate it across the visible spectrum. And that's what phosphors are. And that's what we got better at over time as we went from T12 to T8 technology. And then that phosphor conversion concept also gets expressed in our LEDs as well. So the concept of phosphors that absorb UV and light up in that area and re-radiate it as visible spectrum that people can see is super important. And we saw that here, right? The green layer is the phosphors. Right? We've got that low pressure little purple arc going through the middle. It hits that phosphor. The phosphor absorbs and re-radiates back out into the spectrum. All right, and this shows you across the spectrum of what different phosphor combinations give you as opposed to wavelength across the visible spectrum where the spikes are. Our brain then interprets all of these things bouncing off of objects and blends all those spikes together to show us a white color, right? Our brain's involved in processing all these different spikes and how we then see it. If you look up, as I did so often at physical therapy, up into the bare lamp thing above my head, you could read the ends of these things still in their fixture, in their place, right? I said something about installed base, right? Just last year I was in physical therapy and an installed base in there. It's still fluorescent lamps. They haven't replaced them yet. They've got parabolics in there in a place where you sit and stare at them. And I tried talking them into upgrading. In any case, and you could read these labels on the ends of the lamps. Right, so F32 T8, that means it's a 32 watt, right? 1 inch in diameter, eighth of an inch, right? And in this case, it shows an 841, so that means it's a good phosphor series, so 80 CRI instead of 70. And 41 means 4100 degrees Kelvin, so it's a cool white sort of lamp. So you can read these things off if you go into a facility, have a maintenance guy say, hey, do you got a spare lamp somewhere that you've been using? So you don't have to climb up on a ladder and check this stuff out. What have you been using? Pull it out. Let's check it out. Then you can start to, move along your processes to how to replace it with what. Okay. One thing about, remember I talked that there's still a glowy wire in that fluorescent fixture that provides some of the things for the arc, right? Well, that glowy wire is the thing that breaks. So if you run it at only 3 hours per start, or if you on a regular ballast before we started figuring out different things, right? Um, and you turn it on and off a lot, the lamp life is going to be less because once that thing breaks, it's done. If you start it up and leave it running for a long time, it's not as hard on it. So your lamp life gets better, but then you're burning energy the whole time. So then you start to get into, spreadsheets. Well, which is better depending on my situation for my large, institutional user, back and forth over those kinds of things. But you could make choices as to which you wanted more. Do you want a better lamp life? Do you want better lumens per watt? You could pick different types of ballasts to run these fixtures or run these lamps differently, and the same lamp would run on them all. You could screw a lamp in or twist a lamp in to an instant start ballast. You could twist that same lamp into a rapid start ballast. You could twist that same lamp into a programmed rapid start ballast, and all those things handled the heating of that coil differently and gave you different lives and gave you different lumens per watt. Okay. Oh, one thing this mentions again, and I'll bring it up a lot. All of these sources, their life rating is when you throw 100 into a room and 50 are burned out. Keep that in mind at all times. Oh, here's the 3 kinds I was just talking about, right? Notice on this operating cycle, you can get a longer lifetime out of a program start ballast, because what it would do is it would heat those coils up at the end just to start the lamp, and then it would shut it off. So those coils weren't operating all the time, right? So you got much longer life out of a programmed start ballast as opposed to a regular rapid start. Instant start, that thing hammered those things on the end and kept them running the whole time. So your lamp life is lower, but you ended up with better lumens per watt out of that. So in any case, things that you probably won't need to delve into too far because you do not have to make those choices. You just have to figure out what you got to replace it with if you're going into these situations. Which brings me to another point, right? All of this is wonderfully academic, and you can look at, the original owner's specification sheets and all that sort of stuff. In the end, if you were to go out to the site with a light meter, figure out what they've got now, figure out whether they like it or not, and then take a look at your new options and try to meet or exceed those levels, you can avoid a lot of this analysis or paralysis by analysis. But many people say work on jobs out of state and they can't go to the site. So then what do, right? You have to understand these things to then get to that point. Light output over time. Notice that the little tiny T5HO I showed you only got down to 90%, 96% of output as it got to its life. So it hardly lost any light at all. If you went back to a T8 in the blue line there, 700 phosphors and 3 hours per start, so it's hitting those filaments too hard, right? Notice you're down to 87% of your output when you hit life. 87 versus 96. That's a big difference. That's 10% of the fixtures on a job that you'd have to put in, right? Or a 10% difference in light output that you'd have to take into account over time, right? So it's very important to understand these things when you're doing calculations to try to specify and et cetera, et cetera. One of the things they did when they came out with T5s is they knew that these lamps weren't really operating in open air, right? And all of our life, all of our testing, everything is done in a lab at 25 degrees C, which is like 72 degrees Fahrenheit in an open air environment. Well, what happens when you take a lamp that's been optimized for open air and shove it into a light fixture? It operates differently. It's at a different temperature, and temperature affects fluorescent. So what they did with these T5s is they actually designed them to operate best at 30 degrees C instead of 25, to take into account the fact that they're going to get shoved into a light fixture, and they wanted the most light out of that light fixture when it was actually operational, right? These are the things that we played with, right? Difference in efficiencies by 5 or 10 or 8 or 6 or 7% really made a big difference over time. And having those lamps designed to work even better when they were in a light fixture, right, really helped. And so this was, the evolution of fluorescent sources as we go and why they happened. Coming up on an hour. Ballasts, right? Something had to keep control of that arc. If you let an arc go uncontrolled, it will draw more and more current until whatever it is it's using explodes or stops working, right? So ballasts control that arc. And they're actually pretty complicated devices, right? The magnetic ones did what they did. They did a decent job for a long time. They were often potted with nasty chemicals, right? Old World War II fluorescent fixtures were just horrible, and we had to, you got to treat them like chemical waste to get rid of those ballasts. The potting parts of the ballast to keep them from humming and whatnot, they used just nasty stuff that they didn't know about. But as time went on, we got better and better at ballasts, and we became much more electronic about them when we had circuit boards and those kinds of things to then control everything. But they were still this extra device that you had to have, and we still have to have devices outside of our light source to control them. Now, instead of ballasts and things trying to control an arc and restart, one of the early problems with compact fluorescence was because they operated hot and because they operated in confined areas, they would fail a lot. And then the ballast would keep trying to restart them. And when they were failed, if the ballast kept trying to restart them, it basically caused fires at some point, right? And so some of the early ballast lamp combos were not good, and they had to improve upon their technology and how they handled the failure situation. But they did, right? And we figured all that kind of stuff out. So this ballast that sat in front of there was a very complicated device that had to account for things like not starting. It had to control arcs and the current going through them. They were not simple devices whatsoever. And then you combine those with the way that the sources were, and you had, these are modes of failure for everything. The time for the lamp, the filaments in the lamps, the ballasts themselves. Ballasts were complicated. They could fail too. The things that drive LEDs now, and again, I jump ahead and back because it works, are much more simple than whatever a fluorescent ballast was, much less a dimming fluorescent ballast. That got really complicated and didn't work very well much at all. But people really were trying to push energy savings and things, and like doing things like daylight harvesting. You got in your windows, you wanted to dim the things down, not just turn them off, right? So they'd spend all this money to get these fancy ballasts, and sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. LEDs have solved a lot of those issues and made things a lot simpler on the controlling electronic side of things. Although going into an existing facility, you have some choices if, say, you're not going to replace the fixtures. There are replacement LED lamps that can go into these 4-foots. Some of them can work on your existing ballast. But that still leaves your ballast as a point of failure, so that doesn't help you out with maintenance too much, quite frankly. Then you can put lamps in there and bypass the ballast entirely, work them on line voltage. That gets interesting when the sockets are line voltage. It's kind of dangerous. And then you've got where you have to cut out the entirety of the electronics in the existing fixture, put in a new driver to drive the new lamps. So that's types A, B, and C of replacement lamps, as opposed to replacing fixtures. A lot of times it ends up being easier to either replace a fixture or to completely gut it and have a frame that goes into where the old one was that has its own LED and driver sources, right? Called a retrofit kit or something like that. So there's a lot of things that you can do to go into old fixtures and maybe avoid the failure point of those ballasts. Different ways that those ballasts operated. Some of them worked in series. If a lamp went out, you lost your whole fixture. One of the nice things about instant start ballasts, we talked about them having lower lamp life, but they worked in parallel. So if one of your lamps went out in your 2-lamp fixture, the other one still worked. That was a reason for specifying it right there, right? When failures come, I at least still have some light, right? Even though my lamp life is lower. What are you going to do? So different ways that they operated. And then this is something that gets ignored sometimes when people start to look, instead of going out with a meter to figure out what's there, they're trying to figure it out from cut sheets and owner's manuals, right? Well, that ballast factor I talked about earlier, where you could drive those lamps anywhere from 78 to 120% of their output, is super important. Which one was it? Right? The regular one that went into lots of fixtures only operated your lamps at 88% of what they were rated for. Kind of weird, huh? That we would pick that. I don't know why. It operated them at a few less watts than what they were rated for. So your 232-watt T8 lamps on a regular ballast operated at a 0.88 ballast factor. So it only gave them 88% of what the lamp book said their lumens were. But it also operated them at 58 watts instead of 32. Right? Complicated, weird shit. And we had to deal with this all the time. And then if you wanted to start to massage it, right, you could do different things with different ballasts. So there's what's called a reference ballast, and that would operate that lamp perfectly at its 32 watts, and that's where the lumen charts came from in your lamp books. But once you started putting it into a real fixture and operating on a real ballast, you had to take these things into account, and that was part of your light loss factor calculation. We'll talk all about light loss factors too. Right, here we go. Now we get back into efficiency and efficacy, right? So lamp lumens, if they were operated off of a reference ballast, so like 2,900 lumens was a standard number for a T8, right? Times the ballast factor, let's say it was the regular one, 0.88, whatever that number comes out to be, and then divided by the input watts. And you'll find that running up and down that output scale sort of changed that system efficacy. And the system they're talking about now is not the fixture yet. We haven't put it in a fixture yet. We're just talking about the lamp and the ballast. How many lumens do you get out of that tube? Now you put those lumens into a fixture, and then you figure out how much light comes out of it. All that's taken care of now when we do LED testing, because it's all just behind the scenes, and you just know how many lumens you get out versus how many watts you put in without going through all this stuff in the middle, right? Compact fluorescence, like I said, we still need to have a length of arc to make them work. And so people figured out how to do twisties and twin tubes and tri-tubes and, all this other kind of stuff. And it made for a much better source than incandescent was for small aperture fixtures. Still have problems with heat, still have problems with this restarting thing that I talked to you guys about. Still have a problem with the fact it's a big old fuzzy light source and you can't really wrap a good reflector around it per se like you would with a point source. But then good designers started to look at this is also when you used reflectors in your fixture to shape the output of it, not just optics on LED. So we had good designers of light fixtures and downlights, say, who would work with a particular lamp, and what they would do is they would make the reflector shape such that, say, you wouldn't see any flash off of that reflector until you saw the lamp. And that became really important in terms of glare for things, because a lot of the poorly designed ones, you'd see the lamp first, it would glare at you and there'd be nothing in the reflector, or vice versa. The reflector was poorly designed and there'd be this flash way out there that didn't do any good whatsoever, but just blinded you. I saw some lamps put in up Highway 36 at a hotel where the twin tube lamp stuck out of the fixture, like below the ceiling. How the hell did they do that? I have no idea how they designed a fixture like that, but it was terrible. At least you had something that was more efficient, had a longer lamp life, but wasn't as easily controlled as an incandescent source. So you could do things like downlights of something other than incandescent. So super important development. Right. Germicidal lamps, still some of them utilized, but different sources sometimes today for doing things like what we are all more in tune with now in terms of, like, say, taking the air in our office and running it over germicidal lamps to get rid of things like COVID. Right. This has become a big deal in a lot of places because you can't just, well, you could. One way out of having germs accumulate in your space is to increase the air changes. Right? Anybody's doing HVAC understands that one, right? But if you increase your air changes in the middle of winter, that's all that hot air going out the door. And now you have to reheat the new one. Or in the summer, there's all the cool air going out the door. And now you have to cool all the new air that you're pulling in. So the answer to making it safer and less germicidal is not just to increase your air changes, is to figure out ways to kill the germs in the space. And so there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing that. But we're getting into it a lot in our lighting fixtures as being the source of the thing that kills the germs. And we've got things indirect, we've got things direct, we've got things that go on the wall. There are gigantic systems that go in the middle of an HVAC system that have 1,000-watt lamps in them that the air goes through and they kill, germ after germ after germ before it gets returned into the place. A lot of systems going into place now to try to help take care of these, and we've had them for a while in older technologies. Now, here's a good one. When LEDs were first, when we first got high power LEDs, we started to be able to use them for usable work, like outdoors or whatnot. One of the things that made them worthwhile to look at, even though they were super expensive, was how long they lasted. And people are always out to make a dollar somehow. So they started looking for other sources that lasted as long, right? And that's where this concept of the electrodeless fluorescent lamp came into place, also called an induction lamp, right? Because there are no coils in there to fail, right? They're gone, and they excite the arc inside that thing by bombarding it from the outside, and you don't have the filament to fail anymore. You have a generator, they call it. Problem is that this arc had to be fat and very blob-like in terms of its source distribution. So the picture that you see here is really funny because the HID lamp that used to go into that fixture would give you a very nice distribution running up and down the street, right? And you could pace your fixtures, I don't know, 6 mounting heights on center or whatever the heck it was they would, and you'd still have light in between them. Well, you shove this lamp in there, well, now you've got the life story that the LED had, but you do not have the ability to optically control the output that was in either in the HID or coming up in the LEDs at all. It just became a blob of a light source. And there's some times where that can work, right? Like a post top, right, in your park with an acrylic lens around it and a lollipop looking thing and a lamp right in the middle that just shines, right? They made a version of these electrodeless lamps that looked like a big A lamp, and it worked just fine for those situations. But for doing anything that required optical control, it was horrid. And the only reason it existed was to give somebody an option besides LED to give you that quote long-lived lamp source. And the really horrid thing about it too was that the driver would fail before the lamp, and you had to replace both lamp and driver if you were going to do it. So it was a terrible idea, but it was an economic thing where people wanted to have an alternative, right? That's my take on electrodeless fluorescent lamps. Cold cathode and neon, these have been used since the 50s. I mean, think of all the drive-in movies that you see, or the drive-ins with guys in their 1950s Chevys pulling in with the big neon up ahead and the gals on the roller skates driving out hamburgers. That's neon, right? And neon is an arc discharge. It's just different gases compared to, say, fluorescent and whatnot. The arc discharge that went on inside these things, depending on the gas that you put in, gave you different colors. The arc discharge in these things had to operate at like 10,000 volts. Talk about dangerous. You don't want those down with your kid's, aquarium anywhere. That's for sure, right? 10,000 volts going through these things. And if you broke one, you had to have a glass blower make you a new one. Right? Because they were all blown, I saw a guy making them at a place we had locally at one point, and it was just amazing the craftsmanship that went into making these tubes that they then filled with these gases that they then sealed off and were able to operate at these 10,000 volts, then get you your red neon, come and eat the pig and whistle, right? Whatever sign, right? We've come a long ways, and again, now we can do a lot of the same stuff with LED that's not 10,000 volts, that won't kill children if they put their hands up on it, and won't break and shatter into thousands of pieces of glass if somebody throws a rock at it, right? But it gave you the ability to do cool things. You could do signage, you could do words, you could bend glass and make multiple entrances and exits to do stuff with it. So it became, again, another thing that we got used to as customary, right? But we're not going to use it anymore. So fluorescence, you generate a mercury arc. We understood about how phosphors work. It takes that mercury arc, radiates them. The most efficient ones were 4 feet long. That's why our fixtures were all 2x4s. That's why our ceiling tiles are all 2x4s. Any questions? Cool. Right, HID. I've touched on it a little bit already as I bounce back and forth, right? But HID, instead of being a low pressure arc, is now a high pressure arc, and it's ridiculously hot, right? So I talked about heat labs and things like that being really, really important for fixture development because your fixture had to put up with the thousands of degrees of heat that these things put off, right? But the beauty of these was that they would do an amazing amount of light out of a very small capsule. Okay. And that made for good optics because you could then wrap reflectors around these things and shape the beam of the light that's coming out of them in ways that worked really well for you. Right. So think sporting fields, think parking lots, think anywhere where you can cover a monster amount of space from a single source. And conversely, you could use them in much more tighter spaces to get super high levels of light. So for manufacturing, foundries, things like that, where you had fixtures 40, 50 feet up in the air, you can't do that with fluorescent. There's not enough stuff there. And fluorescent is also very sensitive to heat that way, which this is not, right? Burns at 1,000 degrees. That doesn't care if it's near a foundry or not, because it's about higher temperature than the foundry is. Okay. So independent of temperature is another big deal for HID sources. Yeah, that's good. Let's move on from there. Got here 640. Right. Again, ballast, just like the other arc sources, you have to have something to both get the arc going and then control it. Now, in the high pressure, in the high pressure situation, if you interrupted that cycle, it was really difficult to restart that arc across the high pressure arc that had developed. So you had to wait for it to cool down, right? Before it would restart. So if you were a kid bent on causing disruption in gym class, if you went over and hit the switch, everybody had to lie down for 10 minutes while the lights came back on. I did it. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now because I want to show you some of these. So when I talked about sports and sporting facilities, right, they would use HID lamps in a reflector to, beam light down onto the field. Well, in a stadium, it can actually be kind of unsafe if the power goes out and you have a 10-minute wait before the lights come back on, right? So they did have some systems like this one where you'll see that there's a dangly coming out of the end of the lamp, right? A regular lamp does not have such a dangly, right? This is a regular mogul base position oriented. We'll talk about that for a second too. But this little dangly comes out of here, goes off to a capacitor that has, let's use a technical term, a shit ton of energy in it. And it contains enough energy in it that when this thing would go out and then try to re-strike, it had enough energy to strike across the high pressure arc and make it go again. Super dangerous, right? Super intense. And you really didn't want to have all your fixtures be like this because it cost a lot of money to equip them. So when I went to a Rockies game back when I could stomach the Monforts, for a playoff game, the lights went out, right? And I'm looking around, I'm like, okay, time to go. And I announced the entire section, like, everybody, it's going to take like 10, 15 minutes for lights to come back up. Go get your hot dogs. And me and my buddy ran off, right? Well, they didn't believe me because about 1 out of 20 came right back on because they had these. So 1 out of 20 restruck so that at least I could see to go up the stairs to get my beer, right? But the rest of them took that 10 or 15 minutes to cool down and come back on. And so there was a good 20 plus minutes of interruption of play during that playoff game because of how the light fixtures used to be and this concept of restrike time on high pressure arcs. Okay. Other things that those arcs did, if I can get, oh yeah, that's looking good. All right. Notice that this particular lamp was designed to be horizontally oriented. And notice it's got an angle to that arc. See that? See that looks like a banana or something? Well, that's because arcs fight against gravity. And if you go from electrode to electrode, the arc bows And if you try to contain that bow in a straight tube, the thermals aren't right because the bow comes up against the straight tube and it's not perfectly equal all the way around. This gave us 25% more efficiency by making sure this lamp would stop in that fixture like this. And so that arc tube would follow the bow of the arc between those two things. And we got a 25% bump in how much light we got out of that fixture because we could put a pin on the end. I don't know if you can actually see that pin. That would stop in the socket and make that arc be perfect in a horizontal lamp. So you had to understand, did it have a position-oriented socket? And did you put that lamp in there to then do, say, a calculation to figure out how much light would come out, right? These are all the things that we did to squeeze those extra bit of efficiencies out of the technologies that we had. We moved on. And over time, one of the things that we did is we shoved metal halide chemicals inside of a high pressure sodium arc tube and ran it at those same pressures. And what that did is it give us actually a HID source that had really good color rendering. So you started to see these ceramic metal halide because of the ceramic arc tube instead of a quartz arc tube, right? Started to see CMH. Now they only could go up to a certain wattage and then they started to crack. But what they were really good at is giving us very good color rendering out of an HID source that you could then use to do things like light fruit in the marketplace, in little parabolic lamps, or maybe this particular guy got into a light fixture that we made on the wall that gave us the ability to put optics into a little light fixture and kick light out forward because we had this tiny little thing instead of this. Right? Lamp this, lamp this. There's a huge difference in what you can do in terms of luminaire design in these things. All right, so ceramic metal halide was a really good advance in technology for us. Let's see. Yeah. Back to here. And there. All right. Theoretically, you guys are now going to see that when I hit share. All right. Let's see where we're at. All right, so we talked about these high pressure sodium, warm color, ceramic arc tube, 20s color rendering, but much better lamp life. And that's why the guys who ran streets wanted to have those, right? Mercury was the first HID source outdoors. The problem with Mercury was it would depreciate and not fail. So you'd have towns with lights that still lit, and so nobody would go replace the lamps, but they were down to 20% of their output, consuming the entirety of their wattage. The improvement upon that was metal halide, where they added some salts to it, where now at least the lamp would fail when it got down to about 50% of its initial output, right? Thank goodness. Now we can go report that that light is out and replace it instead of just looking up like, oh, it's burning, right? And then they started to improve on metal halide technology with things like that arc tube that followed, other ways to start the lamp instead of the regular way of starting the lamp. And they got a little bit better and better about lamp life and efficacies as you went along those. Okay. We talked about all that already. Shapes. Oh, this is a good one, right? The lamp I held up with the arc tube, right? That was if you're looking at this, that was a BT37 lamp. And you knew about the range of wattages that went into that. It was either a 250 or a 400 watt lamp. So if you were to visit a site and look up into a light fixture and you saw that geometry, right? The dimple on the end versus the fat of the bulb, you could almost guess what the wattages are by looking up into a fixture. And that can really help you if you're not going to go out there at night and measure light, right? Come up with what you're going to replace with, even if the maintenance guy or the building owners can't come up with what the original fixture was. Right? If you at least get a picture of it, you can look, and by the bulb shape alone, you might be able to tell at least what wattage it was. And then I was very familiar with the way reflectors work because I worked for an outdoor lighting company, right? And if you look at the reflector shape around that lamp to take that light and redistribute it out of the fixture, you could almost even figure out what optic type it was just by looking with a pair of binoculars or a camera, right? If you understand the shapes. Let's see, anything else worthy here? High pressure sodium typically in the tubular sizes, metal halide in the others. They did put capsules of metal halide typically into reflector systems. So you could have a par lamp metal halide, right? There's already a floodlight in itself before it even went into a fixture, that kind of thing. Let's see here. Talked about the life. That was the big deal for HPS and people doing streets. HPS also kept its maintenance better than metal halide. 8,000 hours is maybe 2 years of working at night. And in a metal halide lamp, you've already lost a third of your output. So when you do designing, when do you design to? Just initial? Do you design to mean lumens in 2 years? Do you design to 50% output when the lamp's going to burn out? I knew a guy who did lots of parking garages, used 50% for his light loss factor for metal halide because he wanted to make sure, by God, that when all those lamps were down to their last gasp, there would still be the minimum light levels that were required in that garage. That means the rest of the time, especially when they were brand new, they were consuming twice as much energy as you needed to. But he knew the depreciation characteristics and knew what he wanted to do, right? And that's how he crossed his T's and dotted his I's. Restrike time, we talked about the 10 minutes at the, or 10, 20 minutes at the baseball field, right? HPS comes up quicker. And then you could tell an HPS lamp was going out because it would go on, come up to speed, and go off. Come on, come up to speed, and go off. Whereas the metal halide would either fail and this was something that was big, same parking garage guy, right? Metal halide required at least once a week, if you're going to burn it 24/7, to be turned off for a half hour. Because if you turned it off, it would allow cracks to develop in the arc tube, and then when you turned it back on, they'd fail. If you didn't do that and the cracks developed while they were operating, the failure mode was non-passive, they said. Right? I learned this phrase, right? Non-passive end-of-life lamp failure. Anybody know what that means? It explodes and it sends hot shards of quartz everywhere below the fixture or to the side of the fixture, depending on how it was oriented. So you had to make sure, again, back in your lab, that if somebody were to do that with your garage fixture, that the lens on your fixture would contain those hot shards of quartz should it encounter non-passive end-of-life lamp failure. Right? And all those things had to go into fixture design. Luckily, LEDs don't explode, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. Ballast to run them. They started farting around with electronic. Didn't work out so well, except for maybe some of the indoor stuff. Low pressure sodium, yet another way of running an arc through a tube to get light, right? In this case, it came out as a monochromatic light. And again, it had to have a really long arc length. The beauty of that is it doesn't interfere with astronomical observations because the astronomers know that it puts out light at blank nanometers, and so that they just don't look in that area, and everything else is unsullied. So you'll find a lot of this stuff used out in Arizona. The other thing it was good used for is places where turtles are, because turtles lay their eggs in sand. And when the turtles hatch, they look for starlight. That's what draws them to the ocean. So if they hatch and there's a highway nearby and there's a bunch of white lights on it, guess what? They go the wrong way and they end up squish. Because instead of going to the ocean, they go to the highway. It's not a good deal, right? They can't see this set of nanometers. So if you light your highway by the turtle breeding grounds with low pressure sodium, the turtles will make their way to the ocean and at least have a chance to live as opposed to getting squished, right? And the same thing goes for migratory birds and some things like that. So we have LED stuff that can mimic this, but sometimes it's misunderstood which one you're using because there are a couple different LED sources in this amber. There's one that's called it's a true amber that has this monochromatic thing. But then the other one is basically an LED that's just converted into very warm color, right? So a phosphor converted amber. The phosphor converted amber still has a lot of those wavelengths that the turtles might, see as starlight, and thusly it's not so well suited for the environmental use anymore. And it's not so well suited for the astronomer's version anymore either, because it's got much more wavelength of light to it. So your amber, if it's phosphor converted amber, it's going to look nice and warm like we've been used to since we've made fires since, time beginning, but it's not going to help you with your turtles and your astronomer. Okay. Again, jumping ahead into LED, coming back to traditional sources. High pressure arcs, long arcs, things you'll have to deal with when you come into an existing situation. All right, here we come to the modern stuff, right? LEDs. Anything that you're going to do as a design work from this point forward is going to use LED technology, right? For a while there, you had choices. You could use it or not. You could pay for it or not. Again, like I said, with product development and everything else, it is LED now, period, end of story. And what LED is compared to all of these other sources is it's a solid state device. We're not heating wires until they glow, right? We're not making arcs and then grabbing the radiation from that arc and re-radiating it. But what we are doing is we're grabbing radiation. We are using phosphors to convert that radiation into a much broader spectrum or much warmer light than what we started with, okay? So there's no moving parts. There's no gas, right? There's no mercury involved anymore. It's just this solid state device that when you run current across it, it gets electrons moving from one place to another. And when they do that, they give off energy. So when they give off that energy is given off as light, right? And then we harness that light and we utilize it. And the way that they package all of that stuff is it goes on a base. So even though, let's say for some way you could make it without the base, it would transmit light everywhere. Now light only goes one way. So you already have a one-way light source as opposed to things like a tube, right, where there's light all the way around it, or things like a filament where there's light all the way around it. Now we've got unidirectional light coming off of something, and we can harness that pretty well. And that helps a lot in terms of light distribution and how we utilize a source, okay? Especially the initial LEDs when we got to high power where we could actually make enough light to utilize, they had a lot of problems with heat. And so if you didn't do heat sinking well, you didn't get the benefits of what you thought you were, right? Long life, high efficacy, and all that sort of stuff. We've moved along in design. The high power chips have gotten larger. That is less and less of an issue now. We also then use lots of arrays of medium power chips for things like indoor light, where we don't have to worry about those heat degradation effects, okay? Right. The other thing, the big deal, and I might have mentioned it before, right? All our other light sources, you throw 100 into a room, and when 50% burnout, you call that life, right? LEDs don't fail that way. They will occasionally fail. Their drivers are the thing that fails way more often than any LED chip itself, right? And what happens with the chips, it's almost like going back to the days of mercury vapor, is they will put out light, and they will put out light, and they will put out light as they degrade over time. Now, they don't get as bad as mercury vapor, down to 20%, still lit, and people don't replace them. But what the IES did is they formed committees, and I think it's an error on their notes. They formed committees to find out when you started to notice the depreciation. So put two rooms side by side, start to use a dimmer, and on the far side, when you dimmed it down enough to notice that the rooms were different, they started to figure out what that number was. And our brain system starts to say, well, about 70% we notice that it's darker, right? And so that's where they set life for LEDs. It's when the LEDs are down to 70% of their initial output. They're still burning after that. They're not out. Half of them aren't gone, right? It's a whole different way of thinking about the life of light fixtures and how they put out light and when they, quote, fail or not, right? The only time the LEDs tend to fail is when the driver goes out. So now your driver is the more important part than even the light source. And how that driver is done. Is it crammed into a really tiny thing that's going to fail early? Is it made of circuit boards that if you put it out into something that's too cold, they'll crack? LEDs love cold, but do the circuit boards in the drivers love the same cold? I don't know, right? Depends on the light fixture and how they made those drivers. So the most common form of LED as you can see on this here slide, they make the wafer, they cut it up into little chips. They place the chips on what they call packages, and then each chip can have its own optic and phosphor. Well, sorry, take that back. When they cut them up, the phosphors are already on there, right? So they have an LED chip, they have a phosphor. It absorbs the LED output, it re-radiates the phosphor. And that is time now for another demo. Stop destroying things. All right. So, okay. Yeah. All right. When LEDs were originally discovered, guys at GE, they figured out how to make this solid state device and have this solid state device, when you ran current over it, emit light. And the light that they figured out how to emit was red. And then they also figured out how to emit green, right? And the output of those things were in a very tight nanometer range, very colored, right? And so they started to figure out how to use them as indicator lights. So instead of little incandescent lights in your whatever it was, you'd have little LEDs now. And the little LEDs wouldn't burn out like the little incandescent lights used to for whatever your indicator board was. They also figured out how to make them more and more powerful, and they eventually started using them in things like streetlights, right? Your red and green streetlights. Instead of having an incandescent lamp up there that only lasted 2,000 hours, now they had a source that on its own would last for almost ever compared to what they were using before. And even if they were more expensive, right? If it cost you several $100s instead of a $20 lamp to go up and replace it, they did it because then they didn't have to go back to that light fixture again. Again, think about the maintenance in a city when you have X thousand light fixtures. If you can swap out a source that removes your need to go out there and service the damn thing, you're gonna do it, right? So LEDs really did start to take the place in our society. They took the place as indicator lights. They took their places red and green stop sign lights and that kind of stuff. I had a boombox when I was a kid, 2 little bars of LEDs running back and forth. Yeah, it was cool. I walked around with it. What happened to change everything, though, was a couple Japanese guys back in the 80s figured out how to make a blue LED. And once you got blue, the way that our eyes work, if you had blue, red, and green, the way our eyes take those things into account and manipulate them and average them and send the messages onto your brain, you could make almost any color of light you wanted to. Once we got blue. And so RGB, red, green, blue, despite being good for disco, started to be used for other things as well. And then what advanced it even further, we had a downlight that was done RGB, but what the color rendering underneath it was horrid. Yes, it looked like a white light, but you put a person under it, it was just terrible. But what they were figuring out then is because of our knowledge of phosphors and all the stuff that we'd done with fluorescent lights, they figured out that they could use phosphors to take that blue light and re-radiate it back down into the warmer ends of the spectrums. And that's where we got a white LED itself. Instead of trying to mix RGB to make white, which you could technically, but it didn't work out well. Now we had a blue chip that you put phosphors on, right, to do that. So I'm going to demonstrate that now, if I can, with this screen behind me, and maybe it'll work here. I don't know if I should turn off this other light or not. Here, I'll be right back. So if you look at the paper behind me, right, notice it's very white now, right? And I've got this little thing. It's a square. I'll shine a little hand light back on it. It's got a round disc in front of it, right? I'm going to take the disc off. Okay. So what I've got in this little box here is a series of the straight blue LED chips. Okay. And then on this little disc, this disc is impregnated with phosphors. So when I take the disc and put it over the blue, look what happens. right? It makes it into a nice, I think this is about a 3000K source. So this is called remote phosphor. There's not a lot of that done anymore, but it was done early because people didn't have a lot of confidence in how well the phosphor on the chip itself was going to maintain itself over time. So very picky specifiers, like folks who did museums, right, wanted to use remote phosphor because they knew that the phosphor wouldn't degrade over time relative, to the heat that was being exposed to by being painted right on the chip. Turns out we did pretty good with the phosphors and we got even better. So most all of the LED things now are not remote phosphor anymore like this, but they're phosphors painted onto the blue chip itself. Okay. And when we do that, next little part of the demo, maybe. All right. So when we would take those blue chips, and we would paint different phosphors onto them, we could now make different colors. So I know this is super bright, but if I rotate through, I don't know if you guys can actually see that. Are you seeing the color change on that white? Like if I do that, look at that one compared to that one. You guys able to see that at all? I'd blast you in the camera with these chips. But what I've got here is a series of 4 1-foot strips. Each strip has a different color temperature set of LED chips on it, right? The one that I'm aiming at the thing, it's just not a great demo. Aiming at the thing now is 2700K. If I go to the other end and aim that one, that's 4000K. And again, I'm just not quite sure the camera's picking that up well. But that's how we do it with the phosphors on chips. As opposed to remote phosphor, right? And then other things that you can do without getting into lots of control things, if you just have a color, make that work. There we go. If you just have a color, and what I have here is a roll that has individual green chips on it. So we talked to a building owner. They wanted to outline the top of their building and they didn't want to do color changing or any of all that complicated crap, right? They wanted green. So we have a company that could make us tape that would just use green chips. Very simple, very easy, no controls involved, right? And they could outline their building with a series of green LED chips, right? On a flexible rope. These are things that we could never do with incandescent sources. Right? Now that we can put chips in things, other things that we can do involve making very small fixtures. So here's a pen. Here's a light fixture, right? You couldn't do that with incandescent light sources. This light fixture happens to also be a 45-degree kick. So you can install it on the edge of a room. You've got a lens covering up the LEDs. The LEDs are on a 45-degree angle, and now they'll kick up into the room from, say, a cove, and you can make that cove super tiny, right? Even tinier. Right? This is a light fixture. Can't do that with any other source in the universe, right? They've got a little tiny strip of LED in here. It's got a lens, and you can put this in casework. You can hide this in front of we did these in front of a bar with lots of little cut pieces of glass up above it, so it made it glow really cool, right? You can do things with this new technology and these little chips that you never could have done before. And that process and that design element and that thought is still percolating its way through design of light fixtures, right? We talked about the 2x4 fixture and 2x4 ceiling tiles, right? Because that's the length of the lamp. 4 foot. Well, it's taken us a long time to even figure out that, you know what, we can get that much light out of a 2x2. Still fits with people's existing ceiling tiles. It's a little different. Is that as far as we can go? No, there's all kinds of neat things we can do now. We've made organic shapes. We can do curves. We can do, I mean, it's almost unlimited in the form factors that you can now do in light fixtures that you were limited from doing before because of the limitations of the sources we had to use. And so there's still people just coming up with amazingly inventive ways of using new technologies to make light fixtures, right? And things that you never would have thought possible before. Some of the swoopy stuff I see is just, it's almost science fiction, but yet we can do it. All right, now we'll go back. Let's see where we're at. Very intense. I talked about MR16s being intense to manufacture. The chips themselves, it's an amazing process, and it's very, very complicated and very, very expensive for machinery to do it. But there's enough of it going on now that it almost doesn't matter because this is the way that lighting is done. So there's enough of it going on that they're not as expensive as they used to be, and they're just common now, right? Right, here we go, right? Take a look at the driver size that has to fit into a replacement lamp. And then you think about the driver size that can go into a dedicated fixture, and there's a huge difference. And that's why replacement lamps don't last as long and aren't quite as reliable as a dedicated source, right? Because they have to cram all this stuff into this little tiny dude. And and then you put it into a fixture where you maybe aim it down and all the heat rises, right? And the failure point is not the LED, but it's the driver. So that's why replacement lamps like this do not have the same kind of lamp life as dedicated fixtures do, right? Different ways, right? I talk about that blue. Look at the what's that? The arrows down on the lower level on the second one to the right, right? That's what we're talking about for our regular chip, is we have a blue chip at the base, and we paint phosphors on it to get the yellow and red coming out and let the blue leak through, and then the combination of those three is what gives us this white light, right? There are other base technologies. They talk about the one to the right of that, where there's not the blue as a base, but there could be UV or purple chips. Nowhere near as common, but some people are into that because people are getting frightened of blue light. So it is a technology that's out there. Limited use so far, kind of expensive, but depending on your particular, emphasis, can be useful. The phosphor coatings, which ones do you use? What do they look like across the spectrum, right? How does your eye then blend all of that together? We talked about high power. That was the first thing that gave us the ability to do things like outdoor light fixtures. We talked about mid power, which is what a lot of our interior troffers and things like that use. COB is where they put a whole bunch of chips onto one board and then put phosphor over all of it instead of the individual chips, so that you can have like a disk of light now, and that can be useful for directional sources like downlights and task lights and all that sort of stuff. They also do COB linear now, where they put all the chips onto a row or a strip like I showed you that green, except now they paint continuous phosphor all across so that your strip becomes a continuous ribbon of light instead of dots. Right, so that's another use of COB nowadays. We talked about the integral driver on the left, and then look at the size you have to do a driver on the right. And that's why dedicated driver LED fixtures will always have better performance characteristics than anything compared to like a socket where you screw in a lamp, right? And then you never know what lamp they're going to screw in next. I talked about replacement LED tube systems. That's what you see here on the upper left. Existing lamps going into a fixture operating off the ballast. Sure. Question? Thought I heard a question, maybe not. Then direct wire where you bypass the ballast. and then new system where you put in a new driver and lamps into your existing fixture, right? That's where retrofit kits can come into play as well. Some of these things are valid to replace their existing source with things like power lamps, MRs, things that used to just have a glowy wire inside for looks, right? You can do an LED lamp now for those. If you look at the lower right side and come into that thing with the corn cob looking 3 LEDs by about 10 on a board and then all the way around it. That's the kind of source I've seen put into outdoor area fixtures that completely ruin the distribution of that fixture. If that went into a lollipop fixture or an acorn, it'd be just fine. But if you put it into a fixture that's got an optical system that's designed around a point source, it just completely ruins it. And yet people do it anyway in the name of efficiency and, quote, upgrades, and they ruin their lighting by doing it. So be a little careful in using replacement lamps is all I got to say. Make sure that they're appropriate for the situation that you're in. We already talked about the tape on the right, LED luminaires, track heads, replacement lamps, all kinds of cool things we do with LEDs nowadays. L70, that's what we talked about, right? And that was determined by committee. When does something look different? And that's what we're going to say life is. But they're still going beyond that, right? For a long time. Yeah, they call it parametric failure because we arbitrarily decided 70% was the deal, right? This is what I talked about for different operating currents and or temperatures, right? If you operate LEDs, especially, I think this is for a high power one, right? If you look at the red curve, you're operating that LED 20 degrees higher than you're operating the blue one. And so look at the difference in where 70% happens on those two things. If you don't handle your heat sinking well on the high output LEDs, you can really shorten the life of them. So you can start with the same chip, right? I talk to people a lot. Give 8 different manufacturers the chip. Tell 8 different manufacturers to make a different step light out of it. And you're going to get 8 different lamp lives. You're going to get 8 different efficacies. You're going to get 8 different everything. Whereas before, if we gave it to 8 different people and said, here's a compact fluorescent lamp and make a step light out of it, they shove it into a box, put a lens on it and call it a day. And they would all be very similar. But depending on how you handle your heat sink and how you handle the orientation of the LEDs and everything else, right, you can have huge differences in fixture to fixture with the same source, depending on how you design your fixture. Right? Oh, here's a good one. So we used to not have a lot of choice in color. Your choice in color was determined by the fixture or the source you chose. So halogen was 3000 degrees K. Incandescent was 2700 degrees K. LED can be anything. Right? Fluorescents, we got them down to pretty much 3 color temperatures you could choose from. 3500 was the main one. And then you could warm it to 3 or you could cool it to 4. There were special cases where you even went farther in the cooling, but not too many. Now in LEDs, depending on the phosphorus that you paint onto that blue chip, you can make all kinds of different stuff. So how do you then describe? You can't just say, well, it's LED, like we used to say it's halogen. Now you got to say LED of what color? And this is how they do the colors. So across that dashed line on this chromaticity bin, right? That's right down the middle of the color curve, and that's where your whites occur. And your white going from super cool 6500K, and we call that cool because that's what we're used to. Blue is ice, right? But notice the number is higher. And as we go to warm, the number gets lower all the way up to 2700 degrees K. And what that is based on is if a concept of a block of chalk, and there's a particular mineral that they actually do this with, and you heat that block, right, in a dark room, and you heat that block and you heat that block and you heat that block. By the time you get that block up to, what was it, 1000, maybe 1500, 1800 degrees, it starts to glow orange, right? And you heat that block some more and it goes less orange and it gets more white. And you heat that block more and it gets less orange and more white. And you heat that block more and it gets more blue and less white. And you heat that block more and it gets more blue, right? That's color temperature. And that's why, unfortunately, what we call cool is on the higher end of that temperature range. Because if you really heat that block up super a lot, it's a 6,000 degrees K, it glows blue almost, blue-white. Whereas if you just barely heat it to glowing, 1800 degrees K, it's this ruddy orange, right? And that's what we're used to with, say, incandescent and whatnot. So they have these range of colors, but then they also allow anything to be called that quote color temperature if it fits within these boxes that you see. So you can have things that are more pink than the white that you're at, and they can have things that are more green than the white you're at, all in the same box. So if you bought 5 fixtures at 3,500 degrees K, you might get 5 different colors of 3,500 because they all fit within those trapezoids. And if color consistency is super important to you, then you might want to make sure you're using the same base chips or use a manufacturer that can make the 3 different fixtures for you, using the same chips so that they all match. Because if you pull them from 3 different manufacturers and 3 different chips and whatnot, 3 3,500s might not even be that close to each other because they could be at different spots in that trapezoid and still be called, that color temperature. So just to give you an idea of how all that stuff works, right? OLED used amazingly well for things like televisions because you can make super thin light emitting devices out of OLEDs, organic LEDs. The problem with OLEDs for lighting is that their amount of light that they give out per watt and their depreciation characteristics are nowhere near what the blue chip with phosphors are. So when you really want to, have your A fixture provide light for your office, OLEDs don't make any sense because they don't have the efficacy and they don't have the life. If you want to make a super cool looking wall sconce, right? Because you can use thin, whatevers, that might be just fine, right? For use as a light fixture. But OLEDs have really staked their territory out in things like TVs because they can be super thin. Let's see what we got next. All right, we talked about semiconductors instead of glowy wires, instead of arc discharge sources, right? It already goes one direction. That really helps us in terms of lighting, luminaire design. And if you already have all your lumens going one way, you don't have to waste time on some of the reflector stuff we had to do before to grab everything behind the lamp, right? They can be controlled really well. You can get good distributions out of them. Traditional light sources made into spotlights were very inefficient, right? Because they put out light 360 degrees. LEDs made into spotlights are already going one way, so you just have to shape that one way. So you get much more efficient in terms of how many watts you have to spend to get how many candle power. And we'll talk about those terms later, right? Coming out of a spotlight with LEDs, you can do way better job than you ever could with another source. When it comes back to floodlighting, though, right? The other sources were pretty good at just throwing light everywhere. So when it comes to like replacing things, when you think about replacing a floodlight versus replacing a spotlight, it's a whole different world in what it takes. It's not just the same ratio of watts to watts, right? Because in the spotlight condition, you can use less watts in LED to get the same candle power than you can just lumen counting on the other side for floodlighting. So the whole concept of replacing what's out there with what's coming depends on the usage as well. And it can depend on the optics of the thing that you're looking at. The same outdoor fixture in a spot versus a flood is going to take an entirely different replacement thing because of the way that we control light. Got to pay attention to heat. Again, that's getting less and less important because we've got better chips. Lots of that stuff. Okay. All right. Glowy wires. I still have them operating in my bedroom. Incandescent light to get down low in that really, really low dim, right? They still exist. Fluorescents, we're not able to sell them anymore in Colorado, right? HID, again, we've used them in every outdoor environment for the last 40 years, 50 years. And so they're all over the place still. And we can come in and do wonderful work in replacing them with LEDs. LEDs have come down a lot in cost since we started getting them. And again, there is no product development taking place in anything other than LED. And anytime you're going to do anything new, you're going to be using LEDs. So it's good to understand them and their differences. The fact they can be inherently dimmed is wonderful, right? You used to have to pay a lot of extra money to dim fluorescents because you had to buy special ballasts and all the rest. Almost any LED commercial fixture that you get now basically has leads coming off of it you could hook up to a dimming switch. There's not many that don't. We're getting to situations now, right? Every LED chip used to be sacred, right? Little Monty Python. Now they're getting as inexpensive enough that we're putting different color ones into fixtures and applying a switch inside the fixtures where when you get a hold of the fixture yourself, you can now switch its color by a toggle on the back because you can change which LEDs are operating because we've put extras in there now, right? So there's a lot of fixtures nowadays that you can order off the shelf and go onto the back, and now you can switch it from 3K to 35K to 4K, warm to medium to cool, just as you install them, quite frankly. And that was nothing you could do before without changing lamps, right? Now you don't change the lamps, you hit a switch. All right. Outputs, right? We talked about efficacy, efficiency, how many lumens per watt you get out of something. Color temperatures, my demo kind of failed, but we've got the concept now that you can actually paint different phosphors on the chip so you can get different colors out of your light source that way. You can change the colors of those things. You can mix them. You can have devices that will have chips in them on the warm end and the cool end. And then they've got circuit boards and control devices such that you can now do things like over the course of a day have what's called a color tuning fixture. And you'll go from a very warm source in the morning to very cool midday, back to very warm come evening to help your cycles out, right? So because that's what we're used to as humans, right? Mornings and evenings are warmer than the midday. And so people like nurses at nursing stations at night, if you employ that kind of a thing, you can actually have them on a regular schedule with the way that their brain is interpreting the light around them, right? So they're not so thrown off by just one particular color all night long. You can use colors of white light sources and LEDs to affect how classrooms operate, right? If you got a bunch of little kids, you make it cool while you want them energetic, and come nap time, you make it warm and you dim it. And we didn't used to be able to do any of that kind of stuff. So it's just wonderful where we're at nowadays with the kinds of things that you can take from the folks who want to do what they want to do in their space, apply the LEDs to it and the controls for those LEDs, and make it so it works the way they want it. That's about it. 7:30, 2 hours straight up. Anybody have any questions? Stop sharing. No burning curiosity about light sources? No. Is there anything I didn't show you?
I'm curious why you still have incandescence. Is that just so you can dim it down very finely?
Yep. Well, there's I stocked up for two reasons, right? That one particular, because it just has a very simple, my table lamps have a very simple dimmer switch on them, and they just go way down below LEDs, right? If the LED replacement lamps, if I bought a dedicated fixture with a dedicated driver, this is another thing, right? We're used to incandescent sources warming up as they dim. So now we're making LED fixtures that are called dim to warm, where we employ a very warm chip and a cooler chip, and over the space of when you reduce the output, we move more and more of the output to that warm chip so that they act just like the incandescence that we're used to. We're creatures of habit, and it's what we want. Maybe people get used to them not doing that over time, but I tell you right now, it's a big deal. Lots of things in the houses, lots of lighting designers for residential stuff want to do dim to warm because that's what everybody's used to. They're used to dimming that incandescent source down, and they're also used to it going to a very low level. So if you have a home theater, right, you really need to pay attention to the light fixtures going to that home theater and make sure that they can dim to dark. A lot of light sources, they'll tell you they'll dim to 10%. You think, oh, 10%. Boy, that's dim. Well, it's dim, but it's not almost out like you do in a theater, right? It'd be too much for a theater, 10%. It'd still feel like you need to turn the lights off to get the movie going. So for situations where the really deep dimming is important, you really need to pay attention then to what your drivers and your LEDs can do, and probably not use things like really cool looking European fixtures that come with just a socket. Right? You screw a lamp into the socket. Well, they're not going to dim down to the kinds of things that we're talking about. And then the other thing is, maybe I'll have a dog someday and I want that 100-watt heater. I don't know. Right? I mean, they should make heat lamps in an A style then at some point, right? If you want to get the heat from the lamp instead of some other way, you would think that maybe we could differentiate and just call it a heat lamp and call it a day. But yeah, those don't get made anymore. So hang on. All right. Well, I think that's it for tonight. If nobody has any other questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. It was really
Anytime.
great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bob.
Anytime.
If
Thank you,
anyone
Bob.
has any questions or needs follow-up, feel free to reach out to myself or Brian. I don't know if you have Bob's contact info, but happy to provide that if you want it. Maybe I should have asked him before I said that.
Quite all right.
Great. But if no one has anything else, we'll see you on Thursday, same time, 5:30. That one will also be virtual, and we'll make sure to share the recording before that one.
Thanks, Sally.
Yeah.
Thanks, Allie.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.